Hey everybody, thank you for coming to my talk on sound as a storytelling mechanism. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself before we get started here. I'm James, I do game sound design. I've been building game audio seriously as a career for a little over 2 years now. Been producing music and audio for over 12 years as well. And really love video games. First got introduced to visual novels through games like 999, Ace Attorney. Those are still some of my favorites to this day. Within this community, you'd probably know me best for working on Märchen, which won second place overall during the Spooktober Visual Novel Jam in 2024, and it also won the Best Original Soundtrack, so still super psyched about that. So whether you're already using audio in your projects or you're just getting started with audio, I hope there's some nuggets of wisdom in here that you can take away from this, and so without further ado, let's get started. All right, so imagine you're playing a visual novel and you're a few hours in at this point. You got a general understanding of the characters and the world, and the protagonist is exploring some kind of abandoned building. So they come across this door. There's no music, just the sound of the room. And then the door opens. Now, what should you hear in this moment? Well, you could play this sound. This one's simple. It's a door. You can tell it's a door. But what if there's some magic when the door opens? So just by changing the sound in this moment, the door is telling a different story than just being an ordinary door. There's more going on here, and we didn't even change any visuals or writing or anything. Here's another possible sound. Okay, never mind. Don't use that one. That one's no. But another option you could go for, if the setup is right, is you could play nothing. That's right. Silence is also an answer to this question. I asked this question though because in visual novel development, sound doesn't necessarily have to be just decoration or atmosphere in your game. It can be one of the most powerful storytelling tools that you have, and using it effectively elevates your story beyond just the words of your game. So in this talk, we're going to be going over 4 different ways that you can use sound more effectively in your games. These techniques are going to help your players feel more engrossed in your story and the world, and they can even create moments that would have only been possible with sound. So this first example here, if you've ever played a visual novel, you've probably heard of this before. It's a pretty common trope where you'll be in like a setting where there's some cheerful music going on. You'll be reading some dialogue. Nothing seems to be going wrong, and then the music stops. You feel something in your chest sink. It starts to feel like the sprite on screen is trying to tell you something. It's holding something back. And that's because in that moment, the silence is telling us something is going on and something is not exactly right. That's the trick of silence, is that it really gets you to pay attention. It gets you to engage. Our brains are not really used to the absence of sound. There's very few moments in our lives where you don't hear anything. There's almost always some AC unit running or a refrigerator, birds. So when we place that gap of silence at just the right moment in the dialogue, the players have an emotional response based on the context in the situation. So this can really amplify the text at that moment, making it feel more impactful, louder, without actually playing any sounds. So even though this is a talk about sounds, silence is actually a very powerful tool that does involve the contrast of sound. And you can even find examples of this everywhere in visual novel games. It's all over the place, but just some examples. Ace Attorney uses it right before there's like a major shift in the court case. Of the Devil, you might hear some music pause when Sarah makes a flat joke. Here's some notes to pay attention to when you're applying this technique though. It requires a lot of trust in your writing. So you have to believe that your writing is strong enough to stand without music or sound. When you're using this technique, you have to choose your words really carefully for the maximum impact. And you also need to give the reader time to breathe between these silences. If you overuse it, the impact can get lost. You also need to think about the duration of the silence. Just a half second of no silence is kind of just a flinch, kind of like a hiccup. But 2 seconds feels like a bit more of a punch, and 5 seconds is kind of existential. So you gotta make sure you know what feeling you're going for with the timing. And are you going to cut to total silence, or are you going to also leave some other sounds like the room ambience? If you keep that ambience, it can help sustain presence in the conversation. But if you totally cut it, it can make the reader feel like something is really going wrong. And also consider what do you bring back after that silence? If you return to the same music, it kind of just says life goes on, nothing's really that bad. But if you bring in a new piece of music, it can shift the whole tone of the conversation. So silence is just the beginning of this technique. What you play after it is just as important for the message. So here's something that visual novels often struggle with. It's showing dynamic movement and action. In visual novels, you often only have one frame or one scene, and the sprites and CGs are pretty limited. So it can be difficult to show the characters moving around and performing actions in space. So how can you show a dynamic fight scene in a visual novel? Well, instead of drawing or animating the fight scene, we could try just composing it using sound. So, for example, you could just cut the screen to black with maybe a few flashes of light and let the sound tell the story. If the characters are voiced, you could bring the voice actors in, get them to act out the fight, get some grunts in there, some oof sounds. You can even use tricks like panning different sounds left or right to orient the action in space or to a specific character. And you can also use sound to enhance the story through the ambience. The sound of sirens, wind, or howls in the distance. This helps the player feel like they're in a world that's much larger than just the visuals or the writing. Instead of just a scene with two characters talking, it almost feels like you've been placed in the midst of the chaos when you hear these sounds all around you. And the dialogue is going to land far differently because of the context that this ambience brings in. And so this technique is capable of accomplishing things well beyond your writing. There's great potential in adding detail to events through sound rather than just descriptions. Like you heard earlier, instead of writing the punch struck him so hard that he toppled to the floor, I just played the sound of the character collapsing into a heap. And this makes the player feel the moment more viscerally. It also affords extra details about the event, like what the character was wearing or what they were holding when they fell over. So there's a lot of opportunity for unique storytelling with that. So here's 4 categories you should think about with this technique. There's environmental sounds, so that's world building that runs under the dialogue, like rain, crowds, a TV. You also have off-screen events. Those would be things happening in the story that your art can't directly represent. So that'd be like voices that are behind you or a door slamming that's off camera. You also have audio-based cutscenes. So these are story events that need to all happen in sequence, like zombies pouring through a doorway and the protagonist is cutting them down, for example. And then there's also internal states and occurrences. So this one's a bit more abstract, but some examples could be like a gentle tinnitus loop when a character is fatigued or dissociating, or maybe white noise that builds right before the protagonist passes out. There's a lot of possibilities with this technique to make the player feel what the character is feeling in that moment. So if you want to surprise the player, you need to set expectations first. One way to do this is by giving a specific character a melodic motif or sound effect that only plays when they're speaking. This gets the player to rely on the audio as the cue for certain feelings or character moments. In this case, we have this music track, which represents our character. And once the player's expectations are primed, we can subvert them. You could play a happy sound effect at a moment of fear. Or you could modify and garble a character's theme song to signify that something has changed. Spooky. This makes the player feel like they were tricked in that moment. They grew to trust this melody as a connection to a specific character, and you've just broken that. It's going to leave the player guessing the rest of the game. Whenever they hear this melody, they're not going to really trust it like they used to. Alright, so for a visual novel, this means thinking about audio design and how it relates to your world and characters from the very beginning of game development. If you know when you're writing that something bad is going to befall a certain character at some point in the story, you could try to include some audio-based foreshadowing through hints in their musical or sound effect based leitmotifs. This could sound like a slightly somber tone in the melody, or maybe a breathiness in their reaction sounds. Messing with your players' trust can lead to some surprising and shocking moments when having your audio as the driver of that. So you can really put your players on edge if you use that. A few specific applications of this. Mentioned a few times now, but just so everybody is familiar, a motif is like a repeated phrase, or in this case, it's a melodic phrase in this piece of music. And you can tie association to other characters with these motifs. So in this case, it could be connected to the character or feeling. So like a calm melody to communicate safety, for example. And after establishing a motif, we can strategically alter it at the right moment in the story. And after hearing the same melody hundreds of times over, even subtle differences are really gonna grab the player's attention. You can also do a tonal pivot. So you'll establish to the player that a certain cheerful sound effect communicates victory. And after that connection's been established by the player a couple times, you could flip the script and make that victory sound play at a moment of total failure instead. And suddenly the sound takes on new meaning and depth. So for the rest of the game, the player is going to be paying closer attention to the context of their situations and not just taking everything for granted. Another possibility is playing with anticipation. So building the tension of a moment up to a point where the player expects some kind of scary stinger or massive payoff, huge celebration, and then hit them with something underwhelming instead. Works great for comedic value.
Let's talk about the most direct way to express characters through audio: the voice. Full voice acting is amazing when you can afford it and source it well. The right voice acting performance can make a character feel much more alive.
Yeah! Alright, hope you enjoyed my voice acting right there. Sure know how to put myself into that, I guess. There's also partial voice acting, so you can just use voiced reactions or exclamations and emotional outbursts. That can be a practical middle ground if full voice is too expensive or too technical to implement. You still get some of the emotional weight of a real human voice performance this way. But if you're not going to be using voice acting, you could instead go for like a voice blip. When these are designed and executed well, the text blip is actually a very expressive sound in a visual novel game. There's a lot of potential within blips to guide emotion of a character. The blip is an abstraction of the character's voice. So you should choose the pitch and the speed of the blip to reflect their personality, the mood, and the tone of the situation. A low, slow blip could be read as masculine or deliberate, whereas a high, fast blip might be considered anxious or youthful. A loud, distorted blip reads as somebody on the verge of mental collapse. As you just heard, by varying those voice blips mid-conversation to match the character's mood, it approximates the expressiveness that you might get from a voice performance. It's not exactly the same, but it's cheaper, and there's still a lot of variation you can get out of that. So, okay, Jet already had a great talk today on voices in games, and if you're watching this, this is the recorded version of this talk. So, recommend you check out their talk as well. It should be recorded, available to watch. They went into more depth on voiceover and the technical side of that. But here's a few notes on what voices can do for your game. So, character voices can do a lot of heavy lifting in the stories, not just by filling out the air, but by creating another level of connection to the characters. Using character voices can intuitively help the player understand a bit more about the characters without needing to read up on biographies or needing any exposition in the story. And with voice acting and voice blips alike, you can also set up interesting moments to subvert expectations, maybe a character transformation, for example. So here are some practical questions to ask yourself when making voices for your characters. Does each character have a distinctive audio presence, a blip, voiced reaction, fully voiced dialogue that I can identify in a blind test? If you can't tell two characters apart by sound alone, your player's not going to be able to either. Does the voice blip change across the story in ways that reflect what's happening to the character. If the character's voice is currently static throughout the game, you're missing out on deeper expression and variation. If your character undergoes some kind of transformation, maybe they turn into like a monster or something, I don't know, make sure their voice changes as well. And if you have full voice acting, are your actors performing to the context of the scene and larger narrative, or just to the line? The same line of dialogue can carry a completely different meaning depending on the character's past, present, and even future experiences if you're getting creative. So good casting isn't enough to get the right delivery. You have to make sure your voice talent understands the full context of the story. So circling back to the beginning with the door, what sound should you play when it gets open? Well, the truth is I don't know. There's not one perfect sound for every door in every visual novel game, but you should take in the full context of your story. What do you want the player to feel right now? And after they put down the game, how should they feel? What's on the other side of this door? What stage of the story is this taking place in? What's most important stylistically? Realism, comedy, tension? That's for you to decide. I'll say it once again since I want you to remember this as the main takeaway. Don't just let sound be decoration in your story. Find creative ways to make sound tell your story in a way that you can't just do through writing or through the art. And that could be the link between a character and the player's experience. It could be a fully auditory cutscene, or it could tell the story of your environment through the ambience. Ask yourself, what can sound do here that text and visuals can't? Start with just one idea and see where that takes you. Thank you for watching. If you want to check me out, you can follow me on socials at James Krasner on most platforms, or you can check out my website, jameskrasner.com. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've got a contact form on my website, or you can just DM me. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Big shout out to Visual Novel Development Network team for putting this event together. It was a huge effort getting this all going. So it was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for watching. Catch you around.